How's everyone doing? I know that there are some people in the back still getting coffee, but I'm gonna get going, and it's very lonely up here. So if you want to just move up, feel free to. Before I dive into my talk about behavior change, I wanted to share a quick story, if that's okay. So last Friday, I received a text from my husband, and I promise that this is not therapy, but it said, I quote, "This morning was a disaster. Both the kids aren't getting out the door, no sense of urgency, fighting with each other, then yelling at me when I prod them to leave to be on time for school. We're having a family sit down tonight. They're writing an essay about what they can do to be on time in the morning." Does this ring a bell? Does this feel familiar to anyone? Okay, good. We're not the worst parents in the world. So I reminded my husband that we've tried the whole essay writing thing before, and like no surprise, that did not work. Taking media time away hasn't necessarily curbed the problem of morning chaos either. Because both my husband and I are designers, there are a few times in parenting where using the design process to solve a life problem has actually worked. I urge you to try that, potentially. So instead of thinking about another flavor of consequences, here's what we did. We sat the kids down and we asked them what time they wanted to be at school and why that was important to them. So we pulled out a piece of paper and pencil and we asked them to map out their schedule, going backwards from the time that they wanted to be at school. And for every 10-minute increment, we said, all right, like what's the thing that you need to do to get to that goal? And then for each line item, we talked about it with them and we asked them, why does that actually matter? What does it matter for you to put on your clothes or make your lunch or get breakfast? So why the switch? Other than the fact that we were incredibly desperate, we needed to understand what was important to them, right? We needed to sit down. We needed to give them some semblance of control over how they went about achieving the goal that they've stated. And we needed to give them a sense of ownership. So this notion of autonomy has been studied, it's been written about in all kinds of fields, right? Management, education, health and wellness. I'm sure in a ton of parenting books that I have yet to read. But as Dan Pink, the author of Drive, presents in that book, he says control leads to compliance, autonomy leads to engagement, right? He posits the combination of autonomy, mastery, purpose. And my children are living proof of this. So as a healthcare designer, more often than not, I'm faced with the challenge of designing for long-term behavior change. Whether it be long-term medication adherence or compliance around a nutrition regimen, or even getting someone to exercise, including myself. The success of long-term behavior change is dependent on an individual's motivation. As experienced designers, this should not come as a surprise. But it's true. There's a validated approach in behavioral science called self-determination theory. And self-determination theory is also a well-studied approach, validated, to human motivation that focuses on motivational quality, and has found that behavior is more likely to be changed and maintained when people are self-motivated. It's that age-old quality over quantity adage, and it rings true even for motivation. We no longer believe you either have it or you don't. So as designers, as practitioners of experience, and as builders of experiences, our conversation really needs to shift from just the carrot and the stick, which is a bit ironic. I work at a company called Carrot, to these intrinsic motivators, right? We've been really good at designing extrinsic motivators for a long time, especially in the field of health, to nudge behavior. Whether it be placing a salad bar before chips or designing an insulin injector so you can't see the needle, or even building rewards and leaderboards in apps, right? Like this is all familiar territory. So then what role does experience design play in long-term behavior change? In short, and I know I'm with a friendly crowd, everything, right? In short, everything. We need to design experiences to help people identify why they want to change and then tie everything back to that. We have an opportunity to design for transformation from the inside, not just behavioral compliance. Right? Let's push the boundaries. So where do we start? We've heard a lot of presentations thus far, and each one of them pretty much has talked about the journey. Right? As experienced designers, we start with the journey. We start with the first moment of truth. We design for those points of engagement. And then maybe there's a transaction of some sort that we're trying to get people to. In behavior change, we're interested in the personal changes and shifts along the journey. There's a fairly lengthy set of ebbs and flows throughout the continuum of behavior change. The beginning will be different from the middle, which will absolutely, if we're successful, be different from the end. And it doesn't necessarily repeat, right? It's something that is constant and that we have to constantly be redesigning. But let's start simply with just the hook. We need to help create awareness that people actually have a problem and then make that on-ramp incredibly easy. So at Carrot, where I lead a team of designers, of awesome designers, some of who are here today, we're working on the still enormous problem of helping people to quit smoking. And in this field, in this industry, the hook is incredibly important. Let me tell you why. It's because most people who smoke have been doing it for decades. I don't know if there are any smokers out there. We're not going to out you. Over 70% of those smokers want to quit, and they've tried and failed so many times. Every single smoker we've spoken to has said, it's just so hard. And they're sitting there in tears talking about how hard it is and how many times they've tried. So we've designed a new hook, a new on-ramp for those who've been let down in the past, and a new way to really get to that why that I referenced in talking about my kids. So we've built a year-long program called Pivot that doesn't start with quit. Most quit programs today say, quit now, quit today. The Great American Smokeout is this Thursday, is today. Actually, next week. It's next week. And we're promoting the fact that you shouldn't quit that day, right? We start with get to know yourself instead. And if you decide that quitting is the right thing for you, then we'll help you through it. And so what does that look like? Our awareness building takes the form of some hardware, a breath sensor that gives you an objective read of how much you're actually smoking by measuring the carbon monoxide in your breath. And that's just feedback, right? We're familiar with this notion. And in conjunction, there's a programmatic content in an app that serves as a mirror to that behavior. So in this case, you can see patterns of how much you smoke, you can calculate how much you've spent, and how much you've saved. And then a narrative of that story reinforces your why for smoking and possibly even your reasons for quitting. And it's been amazing to see the response to this. A light bulb is going off in people's heads, right? There's no behavior that's changing quite yet, but they're getting to their why of smoking and why of quitting. Often, however, that hook is not what sustains. As I mentioned, we've got to rewrite the journey continuously. What gets you going is very likely different from the thing that keeps you going. And once you've gotten people to think differently, you've got to help people acquire skills and acquire them iteratively, right? I know I'm speaking to the choir here. People know they want to change, but they actually lack the confidence because they've tried to change so many times before and they've failed. And so we need to gradually give them the skills back to make it happen. That said, this paralysis often sets in without any guardrails, right? So we need to balance. Despite the fact that I've talked about ownership and autonomy and control, we actually need to balance this autonomy with guidance because people don't believe in themselves anymore. And so we need to give them the tools to sort of bring that belief and that faith. So how does one do that? We need to provide the scaffolding for decision making, but don't inflict the decisions upon anyone, right? They're still not your decisions, they're my decisions. Just help point them out for me. And the more you do this in small ways, the more you'll build in people the belief that they can do what they've set out to do. You've got to guide them along so they can collect these small victories. So when I was head of the health practice at IDEO, we partnered with UCSF to create a goal to help young people with schizophrenia, to create a goal-setting app for young people with schizophrenia. And that app was intended to help them capture positive moments, to destigmatize some of kind of the mental health perceptions, and also have a direct connection to coaches, to counselors, to a community, right? These are patients, these are people who are relatively isolated. So we interviewed this young man with schizophrenia, and though really unmotivated, pretty disengaged throughout the interview, he actually took a recording, we had an audio recording, that we made of the conversation, and he turned it into a song. He was really inspired by the way we were talking to him as a person, as we all do, right? We were interviewing him not as a patient, but as an individual. He said we treated him as a person, we asked him about his lifestyle. He didn't feel like a patient for the first time. A typical interview at a hospital is very much about somebody's symptoms. So no surprise that, again, a sense of control was the core need that emerged from all of these conversations. And of course, the need for patients to feel like people. So we took that, and our initial translation of this was to put as much of the experience into the hands of the user as possible. Pretty straightforward. We wanted to give the people the ability to customize their goals. You can see the prototype. This was a paper prototype of the screen. The idea of having a customized app is actually a validated idea, right? Customization, personalization, that's been validated not just in health or digital health, but outside of that. But we realized very quickly that this was not the case for this population and many people who are trying to make a long-term behavior change. This interface was completely overwhelming. One patient said, I can't even look at it, right? Like, I don't know where to start with this. I wouldn't know how to decide. Like, I have absolutely no confidence about what the right direction is for me. And so we said, well, what about this, right? What about just identifying one goal that's achievable in a day? And in fact, some of that goal is tailored to what you might have already told us, right? Again, it's a bit self-determined. So eventually what made it into the hands of those young people was a simple, guided experience that helped them get through their day. They could take photographs to document the achievements. But again, it was a simple reminder of the things that they had identified, or the thing that they had identified was important. And this is where the systems we build, as we talk about AI, as we talk about machine learning, where there's an opportunity to be incredibly intelligent, right? These systems need to know us well enough to guide us according to our context and our abilities. So how many of you have set New Year's resolutions and maybe promised to be on time and was not? Started an exercise plan? Like, basically, how many of you set a goal and failed to achieve it? Awesome. The rest of you are robots. Because I do this all the time. And the death knell of engagement, as we know, is feeling like you failed. So why bother, right? Like, why? I've fallen off the bandwagon, so why get back on again? But failure is human. We are bound to fail. We are bound to make mistakes, and there's going to be setbacks. So we need to design with failure in mind in order to actually be human-centered. The question is, how do we create a soft landing, right? How do we create or build a space where we know that there will be moments of failure, but it's going to catch us, right? Or reframed, how do we normalize these dips into old habits by designing for competence building? Essentially, what I'm saying is we need to design for practice, and we need to design for resilience and for recovery. Khan Academy, as we've all heard of, jump-started a surge in development of this type of adaptive learning in education. So leveraging learning analytics to expand and contract depending on a student's progress, right? If you answer a question wrong, then it'll give you an easier question. It's that soft landing. It's not telling you, no, absolutely, you are hopeless. You will never be a mathematician. It's telling you, let's start again, right? Like, let's take a step back, although the bigger picture might be that you've taken 4 steps forward. Let's continue to remind people of this. Similarly, language learning apps like Duolingo don't allow you to get too far ahead if you haven't been continuously engaged with them. In fact, if you've come back to the app after a few weeks, it sort of kicks you back to the beginning where you started, because it assumes, you know what, you haven't had enough practice time. So rather than set you up for failure, let's set you up for success. And maybe this is just review, which is always a good thing. In Pivot, we're trying to build learning into every stage of the program. Lapses and relapses in an attempt to quit smoking are probably 90% of the norm. And we want to make sure that people don't perceive these as failures. And so we've built in practice. We've built in practice around identifying strategies, trying those strategies out in the real world to see if they actually stick. And if they don't, that's okay. You know, you haven't committed to quitting yet. You've just committed to trying something. And so we have them come back and try a different strategy. Same with practice quits. Because we all know that you don't learn from getting it right. We know this as designers. We preach iteration, we practice iteration, prototyping, testing. We know it's not going to be perfect from the first time around. This is extremely tricky in health and healthcare. Healthcare is all about the binary. It's about outcomes. Did it work or did it not work? And of course, we're hampered by risk aversion. So I encourage all of us to take the opportunity to create more soft landings, especially if you're designing in the space of health. So in sum, if you're designing for long-term behavior change, think about rewriting the journey from hook to sustain, right? And all of those iterative cycles in between, it's going to change. Balance autonomy and guidance by providing the scaffolding for decision-making. Give people control, but guided control. And then design some of those soft landings that, with the knowledge that we're human, right? We're gonna take a couple steps back, even though in the long run there'll be many steps forward. So I wanted to end with this quote from Edward Deci, who's actually the co-father of self-determination theory. And he says, don't ask how you can motivate other people. Instead, ask how you can create the conditions in which other people will motivate themselves. If that's not a call or a design exercise or a call for us to kind of take up, then I don't know what is. So, thanks. Good. Questions? 1 minute? Any question? I think we have time for maybe one question. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Yeah, so the question was, is this design based on any behavior model or just user research? So the behavior model is called self-determination theory, and it comes from Edward Deci and Richard Ryan out of the University of Rochester. It's been applied pretty broadly, not so broadly in health, but I encourage you to, there's been a lot written up about, unfortunately branded SDT. All right, thank you. Mm-hmm.